Welcome. Today we are exploring the intersection of ethnic identity, state fragility, and the humanitarian catastrophes that follow in their wake. As a student of this subject, the year 2024 and the start of 2025 have provided a grim reality check of it. According to the latest data from CIPRI, the global military spending has surged to an unprecedented number, that is $2.7 trillion. Yet despite this massive investment in security, the world is not becoming safer. In fact, the data provided by Uppsala Conflict Program, it reports that the 2024 was the deadliest year for organized violence since the 1994 Rwanda genocide. We are seeing a paradox here. More money is being spent on arms, yet more civilians are dying in their own homes. Now the question is why? It's because the nature of conflict has changed over time. We have moved away probably from a great power wars of the 20th century to today the battlefield is mostly infrastate. It is internal. It is also that defined by identity, by othering, and by the collapse of the social contract. Today we look at how an ethnic grievance becomes a humanitarian nightmare. And we will use the most recent data from highly cited sources to understand why our transnational, the traditional tools of peace building that are failing eventually. Coming to the next, global conflict landscape, if we see the data or focus on the data more. If we see the latest CIPRI yearbook data, the picture is sobering. In 2024 and 5, the global military spending, as just said, it was all-time high at 2.7 trillion US dollars. To put that in perspective, that is a nearly 10% increase in just 1 year. And this suggests that the contemporary conflicts are fewer in number, but far more intense and lethal. Violence has become concentrated, technologically enhanced, and often urban-centered. But here is the paradox. As you spend more on security, the world is becoming very visibly more violent. While the number of conflict locations remained relatively stable, the intensity of the violence has skyrocketed. We saw roughly 2,39,000 conflict-related fatalities in the last reporting year. And this is the highest level of organized lethal violence we have seen since 1994 Rwanda genocide. Now, what does it tell us about it? It talks a lot about the nature of the war that has changed over time, or the nature of conflict that has changed. We are no longer probably seeing brief, decisive battles between or among the states. But what we are saying is that protracted, high-intensity, ethnicized violence, where the state is often participant in rather than a mediator, of the conflict, it is participating more in the conflict. It is not only a mediator anymore. And most importantly, the dominant form of conflict has also changed. Now, traditional the state versus state wars have declined relatively to the state versus non-state and subnational conflicts, which is most important feature of this changing nature of conflict in present day. Now, many contemporary crises are internal, fragmented, and involve multiple armed actors. And these armed actors are essentially insurgent groups or ethnic militias, paramilitary groups, and externally sponsored non-state actors that frequently operate simultaneously and have a very nexus among them. And this transformation complicated the conflict resolution. Intrastate wars end with treaties between governments, and the ethnic conflicts, the intrastate ethnic conflicts, that also require, because of the very complex nature of the conflict, deep restructuring of political institutions and identity, accommodation, and reconciliation processes, which is a deeply complex peace building process. The lethality and fragmentation of modern conflicts increase humanitarian consequences while reducing the clarity of the political solutions. Now, if we focus on the changing nature of peace over time, to understand why humanitarian crises persist, we must revisit the distinction between the negative and positive peace, which has been discussed in earlier lectures. In the contemporary context, this distinction is kind of life or death. Today, much of our international diplomacy is focused on negative peace, the absence of direct or physical violence, as we have discussed before. We see this in the frantic brokering of ceasefires in places like Sudan or Gaza. However, these are often just strategic pauses. Positive peace, on the other hand, the presence of social justice and removal of structural violence or inequalities remains elusive in this context. In contemporary ethnic crises, we are trapped in a not-war state. This is a liminal space where the guns might be silent for a month or for some time, for some brief period of time. But the ethnic exclusion, the things like lack of representation and systematic othering of groups, that remains for a longer time. Without addressing the structural violence, the humanitarian crisis simply continues under a different name. Also, this distinction is very important because humanitarian aid often operates within the negative peace environment. Relief may be stabilized or it can stabilize or survival condition without transforming exclusionary politic struggle structure that exist. Thus, the absence of war should not be mistaken for sustainable peace or positive peace. Now, if we try to theorize the issues that we are saying here, to understand why this crisis happened, we must revisit our theoretical foundations of peace studies. We move beyond the ancient, hatred myth, and as a student, you know that the identity is rarely the cause of any war, but it is almost always the vehicle of any kind of conflict. Now, political elites often mobilize identity strategically during the periods of state fragility. These ethnic entrepreneurs frame political competition in existential terms to consolidate support. If we consider constructivism, identities are imagined, right? But they are made real through the political narratives that is in place. We also look at the Francis Stewart's work on horizontal inequalities, which is a very famous work. When a group feels that they are being economically or politically marginalized because of their ethnicity, the tinder is set. Finally, the security dilemma in a weak state, when the central government cannot provide security, ethnic groups arm themselves for protection. But in doing so, they look like a threat to their neighbor. This spiral is what transforms a political dispute in a humanitarian emergency. And this framework illustrates that ethnic conflict is rarely spontaneous. It emerged from institutional breakdown, elite manipulation, and structural inequality. If we see the UNHCR 2025 data, that UNHCR 2025 data trends report that indicates that we have suppressed a grim milestone. Over 123 million people, roughly, are now forcibly displaced. The most significant shift in the last decade is the rise of IDP, the internally displaced person. 60% those fleeing the violence or conflict zone never cross a border. They are trapped within their own country, often in regions where neither the government nor international aid agencies can safely reach them. And these are not just refugees, they are victims of a total breakdown in the social structure. In places like Sudan or Myanmar, displacement is not an accidental byproduct of war. It is often a deliberate strategy of ethnic cleansing. The humanitarian system was designed for short-term emergency response here. Struggles to address also the long-term displacement that intervened with political deadlock. If we see the case study of Sudan in this context, where probably one of the largest displacement crises was faced. This is currently the largest displacement crisis on the earth, if you see. What began as a power struggle between two generals, the SAF and RSF, rapidly evolved into an ethnicized nightmare, particularly in Darfur. Now, if you see the data, almost 13 million people was displaced. But if you see the humanitarian intersection, over 25 million people are facing catastrophic food insecurity. In Darfur itself, we see a repeat of early 2000s, where ethnic identity determines whether you receive the aid or a bullet. This is a complex emergency in its purest form, where political failure or things like ethnic targeting or famine create a feedback loop that the international community seems powerless to stop. Sudan demonstrate also that how state collapse, generates governance vacuum filled by armed entrepreneurs or groups. In such context, humanitarian actors operate within the limited access, and aid itself also becomes politicized or weaponized. Next, if we see the case study of Ethiopia in this context, it offers a very different yet equally troubling lesson. Following the Tigray War, many hopes that the peace is divided. Instead, CIPRI data shows that the loss of life at that time was increased by 152% in the following year. Now, why this happened? It was because the conflict shifted from a regional war to a fragmented subnational ethnic insurgency in the Amhara and Oromia region. Now, this highlights the trap of ethnic federalism. When you map political boundaries onto ethnic ones, you create a zero-sum game for land and resources. The humanitarian fallout here is silent but deadly. Now, as displacement of people becomes, localized and perpetual, it makes it harder for the global media to track and for aid to be distributed eventually among the people in distress. Now, one of the most profound change in the conflict, if you see, is the decline of the state as a primary actor. We are now dealing with non-state armed groups or NSAGs that function as rebel states. Groups like JNIM in West Africa or various factions in DRC provide their own justice, collect their own taxes, and provide their own security. In last 2 years, the number of people living under the governance of a rebel group reached record highs. For humanitarian agencies, this creates a nightmare. Now, do we negotiate with a terrorist designated group to deliver food? Or if you don't, the ethnic group under their control that are starving, right? If you do, then the risk of legitimizing a rebel state is always there. If you see the role of external actors here, we cannot discuss really probably internal ethnic conflict without discussing the veto players or the external states that fuel the fire. In the 21st century, pure civil wars are extinct. Every conflict is internationalized, whether it's Wagner Group, which is now Africa Corps, and in the Sahel, or regional powers, funneling drones into Sudan, or external actors that provide the oxygen for ethnic crisis to burn longer. Now, these actors often act as veto players in peace processes. They would rather see a conflict that continue than see their rival gain an advantage. Now, this makes traditional peace mediation nearly impossible task, as the real decision makers are not even at the table in the conflict zone. If you see the gender perspective in this, we must talk about the changing profile of the victim. Historically, soldiers die in wars. Today, it is civilians, specifically the women and children. If we see the recent data from 2023 to 25, that shows an fourfold increase in the female fatalities in conflict zones. In Gaza and Sudan itself, we see that the traditional buffer for civilians have vanished. Also, the conflict-related sexual violence is not just a shameful byproduct. It is a strategic tool of ethnic terror used to degrade the social fabric of the other groups. As peace scholars, we must also view this crisis through a gendered lens to understand the long-term trauma that prevents the reconciliation for generations. This issue of gender lens should be discussed or should be studied more deeply to understand a very pertinent issue that fuels humanitarian crisis in long term. Now, if we see the humanitarian development peace nexus, how do you respond? The current standard is the HDP nexus, humanitarian development and peace building. The logic is simple. You cannot provide a humanitarian bandage if you don't address the peace and the root cause and the development future. If we just give food but don't stop the ethnic militia, the food is just a temporary stay of execution. And if we stop the fighting but don't build schools and farms, the youth will pick up guns again. The HDP nexus is an attempt to break the silo mentally of the aid or short-term help. But as you see in the 2026, it is increasingly difficult to found and coordinate. Now, if you see the decline of multilateralism, we are also seeing the death of the liberal peace. For 30 years, the global community believed that if you introduce democracy and free markets, ethnic conflict would vanish. But we were wrong. From Afghanistan to South Sudan, if you see, the imposed peace model has collapsed. Moreover, the UN's ability to intervene is shrinking. Peacekeeping missions are being pushed out by host governments. Uh, if you take the UN mission in Mali as an example, we are also moving toward a post-UN world of security, where interestingly regional coalitions and private militia companies are filling the, they are filling the void. Now, this creates a massive protection gap for the civilians. When it comes to local ownership and probably the imposed peace. Now, if you see that if liberal peace is failing, then what works? The answer lies in the hybrid peace and local ownership. Peace cannot be airdropped from New York or Geneva. It must be rooted in the local traditional justice, indigenous mechanisms of conflict resolution. We saw this with the Gakaka codes in Rwanda or the Palavu Heart in Liberia. However, the challenge is that the local ownership is slow, messy, and it doesn't also fit into the 12 months grant cycle of international donors. To solve the ethnic crisis, we have to be willing to wait for the pace that is locally legitimate rather than internationally efficient or acceptable. Now, as we look at the 25-26 data, we see a paradox. We have the highest number of state-based conflicts since 1946, yet many are now intensity. And these conflicts are mostly low intensity. These are simmering conflicts. They don't always make the front page of the New York Times, but they create a state of perpetual humanitarian need. Now, these protracted crises are the new normal. The danger is donor fatigue. When a conflict lasts 20 years, the world stops caring, but the ethnic grievances and the displacement only deepen. Now, we are moving into an era of layered conflict where a local land dispute between two tribes is layered under a national power struggle, which is again layered under global proxy wars. Coming to the probably end of this lecture, contemporary ethnic crises are not just relics of the past. They're very timely, they are modern, political, and strategically manufactured. The humanitarian crises they trigger are more complex than ever because they occur in a world where the rules of war are being rewritten or ignored entirely. Now, as we go into your breakout session or we finish this lecture, I want to reflect you on this, that global military spending presently is at $2.7 trillion as we discussed before. The cost to close the global humanitarian funding gap is roughly 50 billion. Now we have the resources. What we lack is the political imagination to move from negative peace to positive peace. With this, I come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for your attention.